For 45 years, the two most powerful countries in human history pointed everything they had at each other, enough nuclear weapons to end civilization many times over, and never once fought each other directly. Instead, they fought everywhere else and with everything else. Money, spies, propaganda, science, chess, the Olympics, and other people's wars. We call it the Cold War, and it is on every single GCSE history specification in some form because it explains the world you actually live in, from why Korea is split in two, to why NATO exists, to why there are still thousands of nuclear warheads on alert right now. This video covers the entire story: how wartime allies became enemies by 1946, the crises over Berlin, Cuba, and Prague that nearly turned the Cold War hot, the thaw, the collapse, and the strange decade after. Every conference, every crisis, every treaty the exams ask about. Let's start with a wedding of convenience. The USA, Britain, and the Soviet Union were never friends. They were co-defendants, forced together in 1941 by a shared enemy, and the exam boards want you to know the three conferences where the marriage was negotiated and then fell apart. Tehran, 1943. The Big Three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, agreed to open a second front in France and sketch a post-war world in spheres of influence. Yalta, February 1945. With victory close, they agreed to divide Germany and Berlin into 4 occupation zones, that liberated Europe will get free elections, and that the USSR will join the war on Japan. It looks cooperative. Then, Potsdam, July 1945. Everything has changed. Roosevelt is dead, and blunt Harry Truman sits in his place. Churchill is voted out mid-conference. Stalin's armies already occupy Eastern Europe, and Truman arrives with a secret in his pocket. America has just tested an atomic bomb. The agreements paper over the cracks. The cracks are the story. Underneath every crisis in this course is the same collision, so let's lay it out once properly. The United States ran on capitalism and liberal democracy, private property, free markets, multiple parties, free press, and the belief that freedom means the state leaving you alone. The Soviet Union ran on communism, state ownership of everything, a single party claiming to rule for the workers, a planned economy, and the belief that freedom means nobody being exploited, whatever the cost in obedience. Each system saw the other not just as wrong, but as an existential threat that history would inevitably destroy. And each had evidence for its fears. The West remembered that communism openly called for worldwide revolution. The Soviets remembered that Western armies, including American and British troops, had actually invaded Russia in 1918 to strangle the revolution at birth, and that the USSR lost around 27 million people to a German invasion the West was slow to relieve. Both sides' paranoia was, from the inside, completely rational. Hold on to that idea for the whole video. In 1946, both sides put their fears in writing, and examiners love these documents because you can quote them. In February, the American diplomat George Kennan sent his long telegram from Moscow. The Soviet Union, he argued, was insecure, expansionist, and impossible to negotiate with in the long run. It had to be contained. Containment became the single most important word in American foreign policy for 4 decades. In September, the Soviet ambassador Nikolai Novikov replied in kind with his own telegram. America, he warned Moscow, was bent on world domination and preparing for war. And in between, in March, Winston Churchill, no longer prime minister but still the West's loudest voice, stood up in Fulton, Missouri, and gave the era its metaphor. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Stalin compared him to Hitler. 1946 is the answer to a classic exam question. When did the wartime alliance actually die? Here. While the West talked, Stalin built. Between 1945 and 1948, every country the Red Army had liberated became a Soviet satellite state, and the method was consistent enough that Hungarians gave it a name: salami tactics, slice by slice. First, coalition governments, with communists inside them. Then communists take the key ministries, always the Interior Ministry, which controls the police. Then rigged elections, intimidated opponents, and finally a one-party state loyal to Moscow. Poland, 1947. Hungary and Romania, by 1947 and 48.
Bulgaria.
And most shocking to the West, Czechoslovakia in February 1948, the one genuine democracy left, taken in a coup, Its non-communist foreign minister Jan Masaryk found dead beneath his bathroom window weeks later. From Moscow's side, this was defensive, a buffer zone against the next invasion from the West, which Russian history suggested was a matter of when, not if. From the West side, it looked like the salami slicer would keep going until it reached the Atlantic. Both interpretations show up in exam sources. You need to be able to argue both. The trigger for America's answer came from the Mediterranean. In early 1947, an exhausted, bankrupt Britain told Washington it could no longer afford to prop up the Greek government against communist guerrillas or shield Turkey from Soviet pressure. If nobody stepped in, two more dominoes looked ready to fall. On the 12th of March 1947, President Truman went to Congress and turned a funding request into a philosophy. It must be the policy of the United States, he declared, to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. $400 million went to Greece and Turkey, but the money was the small part. The Truman Doctrine committed America, permanently and globally, to containing communism wherever it pushed, a total reversal of the isolationism that had followed the First World War. From this single speech flows almost everything else in this course: the Marshall Plan, NATO, Korea, Vietnam. Learn the date, learn the quote, and be ready to explain what it changed. Truman's doctrine got its checkbook 3 months later. Europe in 1947 was still rubble, cities flattened, currencies worthless, the worst winter in memory, and communist parties polling strongly in France and Italy because hungry people listened to radicals. American Secretary of State George Marshall proposed the obvious but brilliant: rebuild Europe with American money, and communism loses its best recruiting agent. Over 4 years, the Marshall Plan pumped around $13 billion, well over $100 billion in today's money, into 16 Western European countries: food, machinery, fuel, raw materials. Western European economies roared back and, not coincidentally, bought American goods with the recovery. Stalin saw it exactly as intended: dollar imperialism, an American empire built from banknotes instead of battleships. He forbade every satellite state from accepting assent and answered with institutions of his own: Cominform in 1947 to coordinate Europe's communist parties, and Comecon in 1949 to bind the East's economies to Moscow. Europe now had 2 economies, 2 ideologies, 2 masters. It just needed a wall. The first great crisis came in the strangest place on the map: Berlin, a western island 100 miles inside the Soviet zone, itself split in 4. In June 1948, the Western Allies merged their zones and introduced a new currency, the Deutschmark, the first step towards a separate West German state. Stalin's answer was to slam every road, rail, and canal link to West Berlin shut. 2 million people with about 6 weeks of food. His calculation: the West would either abandon the city, a humiliation, or fight through, starting a war he would win on the ground. Truman found the third option: go over. For 11 months, the Berlin Airlift flew absolutely everything into the city: food, coal, medicine, over 275,000 flights carrying around 2.3 million tons, at the peak of plane landing every 60 seconds. Pilots dropped sweets on tiny parachutes for Berlin's children. The city called them the candy bombers. In May 1949, Stalin gave up and lifted the blockade. The West had won the first round without firing a shot, and the propaganda victory was total. 1949 locked the Cold War's shape in place, with 3 events you should be able to rattle off. First, in April, the West made its alliance formal. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, 12 nations agreeing that an armed attack on one is an attack on all, with American military power permanently committed to Europe for the first time in peacetime history. Second, Germany split officially. The Western zones became the Federal Republic of Germany in May, and the Soviet zone answered with the German Democratic Republic in October. 2 states, 2 currencies, 2 flags, 1 divided people. The temporary occupation map of 1945 had hardened into borders that would last 40 years. And third, in August, at a test site in Kazakhstan, the Soviet Union exploded its own atomic bomb, years earlier than Washington expected, helped along by espionage inside the American program. The American nuclear monopoly was over after just 4 years. From now on, every crisis in the story happens between 2 powers that can actually destroy each other, and everyone knows it. In June 1950, the Cold War caught fire at the edge of the map. Korea, freed from Japan in 1945, had been split at the 38th parallel into a communist north under Kim Il-sung and a capitalist south. With Stalin's cautious blessing, the North invaded and nearly conquered the whole peninsula in weeks. America went to the United Nations and, because the Soviets were boycotting the Security Council that month, got a UN army approved, mostly American, under General MacArthur. A brilliant landing at Incheon threw the North back. MacArthur then charged all the way towards the Chinese border, ignoring warnings, and 250,000 Chinese troops poured in and threw him back again. When MacArthur publicly demanded atomic weapons, Truman fired him, a president disciplining a war hero to keep a war limited. 3 years of bloody stalemate ended in 1953, almost exactly where it began, at the 38th parallel, where it still is today. Korea set the Cold War's template. The superpowers would bleed each other through other nations' bodies and call the result peace. Meanwhile, the weapons grew monstrous. In 1952, America tested the first hydrogen bomb, roughly 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. The island it stood on ceased to exist. The Soviets matched it within a year, a gap so short it shocked Washington. Then the race moved from warheads to delivery. Fleets of B-52 bombers on permanent airborne alert. Then, in 1957, the Soviets tested the first intercontinental ballistic missile, a rocket that could cross the planet in half an hour and could not be stopped, followed by submarines that hid missiles under the ocean. By the 1960s, both sides had settled into the doctrine with history's most honest acronym, MAD, mutually assured destruction. If either side launched, the other would still destroy it in return, so neither could ever rationally start. Terrifying, and its defenders argue, exactly why the Cold War stayed cold. For the exam, be able to argue both sides, the deterrent that kept the peace, and the machine that nearly ended the world by accident more than once. The arms race had a glamorous twin. In October 1957, a polished metal sphere the size of a beach ball crossed the night sky over America, beeping. Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, was a Soviet triumph and an American panic. The rocket that carried it could just as easily carry a warhead to Chicago. Washington poured money into science education and created NASA within a year. The Soviets kept winning the first animal in orbit. Then, in April 1961, first human, Yuri Gagarin, a farm boy with a spectacular smile who orbited the Earth in 108 minutes and became the most famous man alive. America answered with President Kennedy's astonishing wager. We choose to go to the moon in this decade, committing the nation to a goal nobody knew how to achieve. And in July 1969, with the whole planet watching on live television, Apollo 11 landed and Neil Armstrong stepped down. Understand what this was for both sides. Not science for its own sake, but proof, broadcast to every undecided country on Earth, of whose system could do impossible things. In March 1953, Stalin died, and the new Soviet leader who eventually emerged could hardly have been more different. Nikita Khrushchev, loud, emotional, a miner's son who banged his shoe on desks and cracked jokes. In 1956, he stunned the communist world with his secret speech, denouncing Stalin's crimes, the terror, the cult of personality, and began de-Stalinization, releasing prisoners, softening censorship. Abroad, he preached peaceful coexistence. Capitalism and communism would compete, in factories, in space, in living standards, without necessarily fighting. There were summits, visits, even Khrushchev touring America in 1959, charming crowds and being genuinely furious that security wouldn't let him visit Disneyland. But mark the contradiction, because exams do. The same Khrushchev formalized the Warsaw Pact in 1955, the Eastern Military Alliance answering NATO, once West Germany was allowed to rearm and join NATO. And the thaw had hard limits, which the world was about to see, written in Hungarian blood. In October 1956, Hungarians took Khrushchev's reforming words seriously. Students and workers rose in Budapest, tore down Stalin's statue, and swept the reformer Imre Nagy into power. For a few euphoric days it worked. Soviet troops even began withdrawing. Then Nagy crossed the invisible line. He announced Hungary would leave the Warsaw Pact and become neutral. for Moscow that threatened to unravel the entire buffer zone, and on the 4th of November, around 1,000 Soviet tanks rolled back into Budapest. Hungarians fought them with rifles and petrol bombs. Around 20,000 were killed or wounded, 200,000 fled the country, and Nagy, lured out of asylum with a promise of safety, was tried in secret and hanged. And the West? Radio Free Europe had spent years encouraging exactly this uprising. When it came, the West sent sympathy and nothing else. Nobody would start World War III over Hungary, especially not in the same week as the Suez Crisis. Every satellite state absorbed the double lesson. Moscow will shoot, and Washington will watch. By 1960, the thaw was scheduled for its biggest test, a four-power summit in Paris, with Berlin on the table. 2 weeks before it opened, on May Day, a Soviet missile finally reached what had been untouchable, an American U-2 spy plane, cruising at 70,000 feet over Russia, photographing military sites, as U-2s had been doing secretly for 4 years. Washington, assuming the pilot was dead and the aircraft destroyed, announced that a weather research plane had gone missing. Khrushchev then produced his theater. Not only the wreckage, but the pilot, Francis Gary Powers, alive, captured, and confessing. He had caught the United States in a direct, public lie. In Paris, Khrushchev demanded an apology. Eisenhower refused to give one. Khrushchev stormed out, and the summit collapsed within hours, taking with it the best chance for years of a Berlin settlement. Powers got 10 years, and was later swapped for a Soviet spy on a Berlin bridge. For exams, the U-2 affair is the perfect example of how espionage repeatedly wrecked diplomacy. Berlin, meanwhile, was bleeding the East dry. Between 1949 and 1961, around 2.7 million East Germans, disproportionately young, skilled, educated, doctors, engineers, teachers, simply walked into West Berlin and flew out to a new life. It was the one open gate in the Iron Curtain, and it was an existential hemorrhage for East Germany. Khrushchev issued ultimatums demanding the West leave Berlin. The West refused, and in the small hours of the 13th of August 1961, East German troops unrolled barbed wire through the middle of the city. Within days, it was concrete. Families were split mid-street. People jumped from apartment windows on the border line into firemen's nets. The windows were then bricked up. Over the following decades, at least 140 people died trying to cross. Kennedy's response was honest and cold-blooded. A wall, he noted privately, is a hell of a lot better than a war, and in 1963 he stood before it and told the city, "Ich bin ein Berliner." The wall solved Khrushchev's refugee problem and became, for 28 years, communism's most damning advertisement, a system that had to cage its people in. The road to the Cold War's most dangerous moment starts on a Caribbean island. In 1959, Fidel Castro's guerrillas overthrew Cuba's corrupt, American-backed dictator Batista. Castro wasn't initially a communist, but he nationalized American-owned businesses. Washington answered with a trade embargo on the sugar crop Cuba lived on, and Moscow happily bought it all instead. Each move pushed Cuba further east. Then, in April 1961, the new President Kennedy inherited and approved a CIA scheme, land 1,400 armed Cuban exiles at the Bay of Pigs to spark a national uprising. It was a catastrophe in every way an operation can be. The promised air support was cut back, the uprising never came, and the exiles were killed or captured on the beach within 3 days. The Bay of Pigs humiliated Kennedy publicly, convinced Castro that a full American invasion was coming, and convinced Khrushchev that this young president was weak and could be pushed. All three consequences point directly at what happened next. In October 1962, an American U-2 over Cuba photographed something that stopped the world. Soviet nuclear missile sites under construction, 90 miles from Florida, capable of striking most American cities within minutes. Khrushchev's gamble had 3 motives worth listing: protect Cuba from invasion, close the real missile gap, since America had missiles in Turkey on the Soviet border, and test Kennedy. For 13 days, Kennedy and his ex-com advisors argued in secret while the military pressed for airstrikes and invasion, options we now know would likely have triggered nuclear release, because Soviet commanders in Cuba already had battlefield nuclear weapons and authority to use them. Kennedy chose the middle path: a naval quarantine, a blockade in all but name, and a public ultimatum on live television. American forces went to DEFCON 2, one step from nuclear war, for the only confirmed time in history. Soviet ships steamed towards the line, and the planet genuinely did not know if it would see the weekend. Dean Rusk's line captures the moment. We're eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked. The way out was a deal with a hidden compartment, and exams love asking who really won. Publicly, Khrushchev withdraws the missiles, and America pledges never to invade Cuba. Secretly, Kennedy also agrees to remove American Jupiter missiles from Turkey within months, provided the Soviet half of that bargain is never announced. So Kennedy looked like the unflinching victor, which helped him enormously. Khrushchev, who had arguably achieved both his stated aims, looked like the man who backed down, which helped end his career 2 years later, while Castro, never consulted, was furious with everyone. But the deeper result was that both leaders had looked over the edge together and been equally terrified. Within a year came the Moscow-Washington hotline, a direct teletype link so the next crisis could be talked down in hours rather than days, and the Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963, the first real arms control agreement, ending nuclear tests in the atmosphere. The scariest fortnight of the century became, oddly, the beginning of the first real restraint. 12 years after Hungary, the East tested the leash again, this time carefully. In January 1968, Alexander Dubček came to power in Czechoslovakia promising socialism with a human face, not leaving the Warsaw Pact, not abandoning communism, just softening it, free speech, free press, real debate, rehabilitation of victims. The Prague Spring bloomed through the summer, and the whole Soviet bloc watched, which was precisely the problem. Leonid Brezhnev, Khrushchev's star successor, feared the infection spreading, and on the night of the 20th of August 1968, 500,000 Warsaw Pact troops invaded. There was almost no armed resistance. That lesson had been learned in Budapest, but Czechs stood in front of tanks arguing with the crews, repainted street signs so convoys got lost, and in January 1969 a student named Jan Palach burned himself alive in Wenceslas Square in protest. Brezhnev then made the rule explicit. The Brezhnev Doctrine declared Moscow's right to intervene in any socialist country that strayed. Freedom inside the bloc now had a written ceiling. Step back from Europe for a moment, because for most of the planet, the Cold War was never cold. The superpowers fought through proxies on almost every continent, and you should be able to name examples. Vietnam was the biggest. America poured in 500,000 troops to stop the communist North conquering the South, dropped more bombs than fell in all of World War II, lost 58,000 of its own, and left in 1973 having achieved almost nothing. Saigon fell 2 years later. Vietnam gets its own video. But for this course, its Cold War meaning is what matters. Containment's costliest failure, and proof that superpower money and firepower could lose to determine locals. The same pattern, with the roles arranged differently, played out in Angola, in Ethiopia, in Middle East, in Latin America, where Washington backed coups against elected leftists, and eventually in Afghanistan, where the roles reversed completely. Millions died in these hot edges of the Cold War, in countries that appear in the textbooks as single sentences. Keep them in mind whenever anyone tells you nobody died in the Cold War. By the 1970s, both giants needed a breather, and the era of relaxation gets a French name, détente. The motives were unsentimental. America was traumatized and nearly bankrupted by Vietnam. The Soviet economy was stagnating under its military burden. Both were terrified by how close 1962 had been, and Nixon had a new card to play, his opening to Communist China in 1972, which panicked Moscow into wanting better relations with Washington first. The exam checklist, SALT I, 1972, the first treaty actually limiting numbers of strategic missiles. The Helsinki Accords, 1975, where 35 nations accepted Europe's post-war borders and the Soviets, in exchange, signed promises on human rights, promises dissidents like Solzhenitsyn and Sakharov would spend the next decade holding them to. And the perfect photo opportunity. The Apollo-Soyuz mission of 1975, an American and a Soviet spacecraft docking in orbit, crews shaking hands through the hatch, the space race ending in a handshake. It looked like the Cold War was winding down. It had one more act. Détente died on Christmas Eve, 1979, when Soviet troops poured into Afghanistan to rescue a failing communist government from an Islamist rebellion. Moscow expected months. It got a decade. Afghan Mujahideen fighters, armed and funded through the CIA and Pakistan with billions of dollars, including later shoulder-fired Stinger missiles that swatted Soviet helicopters from the sky, bled the Red Army in the mountains year after year. Around 15,000 Soviet soldiers died, and over 1 million Afghans. The war became exactly what everyone called it, the Soviet Union's Vietnam. The West's response buried détente completely. President Carter withdrew SALT II from the Senate, embargoed grain, and led a 65-nation boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics. The Soviets boycotted Los Angeles right back in 1984. For your essays, Afghanistan matters twice over. It restarted the Cold War at its coldest, and the endless, unwinnable drain of it became one of the pressures that would crack the Soviet system open a decade later. Into this deep freeze walked Ronald Reagan, elected in 1980 on the argument that détente had been surrender in slow motion. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire in public and rearmed on a scale designed to be unmatchable. The defense budget nearly doubled, new missiles went into Europe, and in 1983 he announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, instantly nicknamed Star Wars, a shield of space-based lasers that would make Soviet missiles useless. The technology barely existed, but the threat was economic, and Moscow knew it. Matching SDI meant a computing and spending race the creaking Soviet economy simply could not run. And 1983 showed how dangerous the freeze had become. That September, Soviet defenses shot down a Korean airliner that strayed into their airspace, killing all 269 aboard. Weeks later, a NATO exercise called Able Archer 83 rehearsed nuclear release procedures so realistically that parts of the Soviet leadership, primed to expect a first strike, put forces on alert. Historians now rank it with Cuba among the nearest misses. The Cold War was old, and it was not getting safer. Then the Soviet Union ran out of old men. After 3 leaders died in 3 years, the Politburo turned in 1985 to Mikhail Gorbachev, 54, clever, open, and clear-eyed about the disaster he had inherited, an economy that could build missiles but not washing machines, an unwinnable war in Afghanistan, and a superpower status held together by fear. His answers became 2 exam-essential Russian words: glasnost, openness, real information, real debate, the crimes of Stalin finally printed in Soviet newspapers. Perestroika, restructuring, trying to rewire the planned economy with elements of markets and honesty about its failures. Abroad, he needed the arms race to stop, and in Reagan he found, against every expectation, a partner. Their summits at Geneva and Reykjavik came within a sentence of abolishing nuclear weapons entirely, wrecked only by Star Wars, and in 1987 they signed the INF Treaty, eliminating, not limiting, abolishing, an entire class of nuclear missiles, with inspectors from each side walking the other's bases. And one more decision mattered most of all. Gorbachev quietly retired the Brezhnev Doctrine. The satellite states would no longer be held by force. Nobody in Eastern Europe quite believed it. In 1989, they tested it. 1989 is the most astonishing year in this whole course, and it happened almost entirely without bloodshed. Poland went first. Solidarity, the banned trade union led by electrician Lech Walesa, forced semi-free elections in June and won every seat it was allowed to contest. By August, Poland had the bloc's first non-communist prime minister since the 40s, and Moscow did nothing. Hungary opened its border fence with Austria, and East Germans began escaping through the gap by the tens of thousands. By November, East Germany was drowning in protest marches. And then came history's greatest press conference blunder. On the 9th of November, official Gunter Schabowski was handed notes about new, limited travel regulations and, asked when they took effect, shuffled his papers and improvised. As far as I know, effective immediately. East Berlin heard it on the evening news as, "The wall is open." Tens of thousands surged to the checkpoints, where baffled guards, with no orders and no appetite to shoot, finally lifted the barriers. Strangers wept and danced on top of the wall all night, and hammered it to pieces in the days that followed. Within weeks, communist governments fell in Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania. The empire of the buffer zone dissolved in a single autumn. The endgame ran on its own momentum. Germany reunified in October 1990, inside NATO, something unthinkable 5 years earlier, and Gorbachev accepted it. The Warsaw Pact formally dissolved in mid-1991. But glasnost had opened a door Gorbachev couldn't close. The Soviet Union's own 15 republics, Lithuania first, began demanding the same independence Eastern Europe had just taken. In August 1991, communist hardliners tried to save the old order the old way. They detained Gorbachev at his holiday villa and sent tanks into Moscow. The coup collapsed in 3 days, defeated not by an army but by crowds, and by Boris Yeltsin, president of the Russian Republic, standing on a tank outside the parliament. The coup meant to save the USSR killed it. Republic after republic declared independence, and on Christmas Day 1991, Gorbachev resigned as president of a country that no longer existed. The red flag over the Kremlin came down that evening. The Cold War did not end with a bang, or a treaty, or a victory parade. One of the two players simply left the table. Some exam boards, especially in Northern Ireland, follow the story into the world the Cold War left behind. So here is that coda. The United States stood suddenly alone, history's only superpower, and the 1991 Gulf War showed the new order. When Saddam Hussein's Iraq swallowed Kuwait, America led a UN-backed coalition of 30-plus nations, including, remarkably, Soviet diplomatic support, and expelled him in a 100-hour ground war. Through the 90s, NATO, built to fight Moscow, found new work in the wars of collapsing Yugoslavia, and began expanding eastward into the very countries the Warsaw Pact had once garrisoned, a decision Russians would nurse as a grievance for decades. Then, on the 11th of September 2001, the threat changed shape entirely, not a rival superpower, but 19 hijackers. America invaded Afghanistan within the month, and in March 2003, far more controversially, and without UN backing, invaded Iraq. Where 2003 closes the syllabus, the point to make is simple. The bipolar world of this entire video, 2 giants, 2 blocks, 1 balance, was gone, and nothing so stable had replaced it. So, who ended the Cold War? This is a real historian's fight, and laying it out gets you evaluation marks, so learn the 4 candidates. Case 1. Reagan won it by spending the Soviet Union into the ground. SDI and the 80s build-up presented Moscow with a race it could not run, forcing reform. Case 2. Gorbachev ended it, and deserves the credit because empires facing bankruptcy usually choose repression, and he chose, again and again, not to shoot. The man himself got the Nobel Peace Prize on exactly this argument. Case 3. The peoples of Eastern Europe ended it, Polish strikers, Hungarian fence cutters, Leipzig marchers, Berliners with hammers, by simply refusing to be ruled once the fear lifted. Case 4. Nobody ended it. The Soviet economic system was terminally ill by 1980, and everything after was symptom management. The honest answer, and the one that scores best, is that these causes needed each other. The pressure without Gorbachev gets you a crackdown. Gorbachev without the pressure gets slow reform. Both without the crowds gets a negotiated, half-open empire. History's biggest events rarely have one author. That is the Cold War, end-to-end, allies who feared each other into 45 years of armed peace, a wall through a city, 13 days over Cuba, proxy wars that were anything but cold for the people inside them, and an ending nobody predicted, delivered partly by a fumbled press conference. If you keep one framework for the exam, keep this. Every crisis in this course is the same 3 ingredients in different amounts: ideology, fear, and prestige, and every source you're shown was written by someone standing on one side of that curtain. Check your specification for which crises you need in depth, then come back to the chapters here for revision. This video is part of our GCSE History playlist, one complete video for every topic on every exam board. Weimar and Nazi Germany is already up, and Medicine Through Time is next. Subscribe, tell your revision group, and good luck in the exam hall. You've got this.